Hello, Mia DeBolt here, bringing you more transparency in trading. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about the trades that I took this morning and kind of the thought process behind them, as well as what some lessons are that I learned from them. So it has been a little bit since I have taken a trade, and I am only focusing on one challenge at a time. So the funded trader is the 8 cap MT4 that I was using today, and so you'll see that in my video review. So FTMO, just to give you a quick recap, I am on a repeat of the $200,000 challenge. And so I just put that to the side because I only have about 10 more days on the funded trader. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the charts. All right, so this morning I saw that the DXY had been respecting the volume imbalance on the daily, and we also had a big opening range gap in the E-mini. So that's kind of the two things that I like to check before I actually jump on the charts for the CFDs. So today is the day before FOMC, which is tomorrow at 11 o'clock PST. And so I was expecting kind of a small range day. And so that was kind of my expectations. And I was also seeing that the DXY was bullish. So I was expecting the other indices to go down. The other expectation that I had was because we had a big opening range, I was expecting price to actually return to that range at some time today. So whether it was the last hour of trading, which tends to be around 11:45 my time, and it didn't really happen. So we'll just jump into the charts and you'll see exactly where my expectations kind of fell short. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into exactly where I started taking the trades. So you know what I was expecting for the morning. So I was looking for with trend setups, and those setups never transpired because price never came back to them. So I am just gonna jump to where I was expecting price to actually make a reaction and for me to capitalize on that. So here's very close to where I actually jumped in. So I'm just gonna fast forward this. And so I was looking at this as a 1-minute breaker market structure shift and for price to actually go back to that opening range. So that's kind of where my first trade started. And so let's just start here. Okay, so I was looking at that 1-minute breaker, and it's okay to kind of color outside of the lines. I was expecting that 1-minute breaker to hold price up and for us to start making it to the buy side. And so I'm just taking snapshots, kind of filling in my journal right now. And so I'm just going to fast forward this because it was a fairly short trade, and buy side was up here. It was in the short-term high. However, it didn't necessarily get to my target. Okay, so one thing to note, I did have this 1-minute fair value gap that acted as resistance, and you will see that in a very short bit. So it was an old fair value gap. It was traded through with conviction. So this pink shaded area is a BISI. So it's a Buyside Imbalance, Sellside Inefficiency. And so that's what it was trading down into the first quarter of it. So I was expecting some type of reaction, and it did give me a reaction. So I did get a potential of 0.7% out of this had I closed it from there. And so I was expecting this to be a breakaway gap and for price to just continue up because this would be a bullish order block if it were still bullish. And so this is kind of like the retracement. So I did move my stop to break even because I was expecting that breaker to hold price up. And what it does end up doing is it ends up going down into this fair value gap, ends up taking out this short-term low, and ends up kind of taking a continuation to the downside. So I'm going to fast forward this. This trade does fail, and you can see that here. So had I stayed in that was a 1% risk. I would have lost 1%. So I did break even for the morning of 0.02%, and I continued on in the morning, just continuing to analyze. I did not enter any more trades, and the risk to reward just wasn't in the cards. So I just wasn't seeing too many targets that were nearby, and that was the reason that I didn't take any more trades in the morning. So that brings us to the PM session. So whenever I take a loss or don't really feel price action in the morning, I like to show up for the PM session and just take a look and see if there's any opportunity there. All right, so in the PM session, we did see that we're below this 1 hour fair value gap, below this BISI, and we are pushing up pretty good. So I am taking a look at that. So one of the things that I did in the PM session was that I actually invested in the E-mini live data. So the real-time data is only like $5 a month, and for one reason or another I was actually holding off on investing in that. However, I just kind of got fed up with looking at delayed data for the E-mini and trying to analyze my CFD. So that's the reason that I invested in the E-mini data. And to be honest, I don't know what I was holding out for, because one of the big differences is that sometimes the long-term lows, like the weekly low that was taken in the E-mini, is actually not taken in the CFD. So while I'm looking at a long-term low and maybe a liquidity pool, it's actually already been taken in the E-mini. So it is somewhat different data, and it's important to actually be able to see what the E-mini is actually doing. All right, so for my PM trade, I was looking at a market structure shift. There was enough evidence here that I could see a buy, a short-term buy. So here we have a 1 minute fair value gap. The consequent encroachment has been respected, and so it's starting to push up. And so this is where I'm waiting on that down candle. So to be honest, I listened to ICT's Twitter space on getting funded for his son, Cameron, on Sunday. And he really made his point, which is you buy in a discount, you buy with down candles. And so that's definitely something that I'm working on. So I'm going to wait on the down candle. You'll see here that this is starting to go up. This is where he kind of yelled at his son, and it really hit home with me that, you know, I would be chasing price had I bought when price was going up. So I am waiting for price to come down, especially if it wants to come down and bounce off that 1 minute fair value gap. So that's where I'm waiting for this 1 minute candle to be black. And I do hesitate a little bit, but it was somewhat black when I bought it. So unfortunately, because the spreads are not so great, this is where my trade actually entered. And so I'm just going to fast forward this, and you'll see that it does end up taking some of this buy side liquidity, but not before it turns around and ends up taking me out. All right, so this 1 minute fair value gap, it can be reclaimed again. And so I'm already trimming my risk because I have 1% on this, and quite frankly, I just want to preserve my capital. So I already trimmed it a little bit from here to down here, and you'll see it just has displacement down to the downside. It does have equal highs, which are really beautiful. However, it does actually go into profit a little bit, makes another equal high, doesn't really power through that, just kind of sweeps a little bit of liquidity and then starts pushing down. So 0.2 is kind of the high of that trade. And so I'm just going to fast forward this because I have trimmed my risk to that short-term low, which ends up being not a very good place. So there's displacement down to the downside. You can see that 1 minute bullish order block. If it were a bullish order block, it's not respected. And so it does end up taking me out, and doing so fairly quickly. But one thing that I want you to notice, and you can see this after all the dust is settled, it does take out that short-term low, which ends up being my stop loss, and I do end up losing 0.68, I believe, on this trade. Okay, so 0.68, you can see that it goes down to the consequent encroachment, and it actually, I believe, comes down all the way to the bottom of that fair value gap. So let's just fast forward. I do want you to see how beautiful price action was, and had I just kept my stop loss at the normal place, it probably would have turned around and I would have been in some profit. So that was my original stop loss, and it does end up continuing, I believe, down to the downside. So let's just fast forward and see what happens. Okay, so it does come down. I'm looking at possibly selling, and so yes, my stop loss would have been probably safe. The reason I say that is because the ask line is up here. However, with 8 cap, I never put anything past them. So that's kind of where I'm glad that I got out and just minimize my risk. Okay, so that was a 1% risk, and so I only lost 0.68, and that was, not such a big deal. Okay, so I keep looking at that 1 minute fair value gap, and I do expect price to take that buy side liquidity. And so that's where, again, I was most likely just wanting to be right. And so I just entered with a 0.5% risk. All right, so I did do something correctly and I lowered my risk. And so this was a shift in market structure. It's coming down. It did leave a fair value gap. And so I am expecting that 1 minute fair value gap to hold price. All right, so let's fast forward. It does end up turning around and I trim my risk. All right, so it stops at about consequent encroachment of that wick and at that 1 minute bullish order block. Let's continue. So it plays around a little bit and then it starts accelerating to the buy side liquidity that's resting just above here. And so you'll see that it actually does go to that buy side liquidity and it's a 0.2 or so potential profit. So had I taken profit there, it would have been 0.28 or so, and that would have been a nice little recoup. However, I didn't end up closing it. So I do end up closing this and trimming my risk again. So I'm trimming my risk to that 1 minute fair value gap. I don't want to see that encroached upon the mean threshold of that 5 minute bullish order block. And so if it is bullish, it should continue up. And so that's kind of what I'm expecting. So it does play around here and then starts displacing to the downside. And I do end up losing this trade as well. So this trade kind of plays around with my thought process. It is just really going sideways if you look at the bigger picture, and that's kind of where I got caught up in the lower time frame and wasn't really looking at the big picture, which is it's just consolidating and it's not really moving much at all for the end of the day. So I was expecting the end of the day to start going to buy side, but it didn't end up doing that. So it does play around and it ends up closing out, and I took a negative 0.76 loss for the day for 3 trades. And if I hadn't managed my risk and reduced my risk in half, then it might have been more. If I hadn't trimmed my risk, it might have been more. And so I'm pretty happy with the way that I traded, even if it was a loss. So just to give you a little recap of my day, it was 3 losses, and I'm okay with that because the losses are just getting me closer to the wins. And if my wins are bigger than my losses, then I'm most likely going to pass my challenges and get to that 7-figure mark as soon as I get in sync with the market. So that was the big lesson for me today, which is go with the trend, and the trend is my friend, as opposed to trying to maybe predict reversals or just look at every market structure shift and expecting price to reverse. So a recap of the funded trader, you can see here that I'm on 10 days of trading and I do still have 8 days left. I'm at 1.08% and I took a few losses today, and that's okay. So these losses were against trend, and so that's kind of where I'm going to look at the morning trend and see exactly what the trend is and how I might be able to capitalize on that. So just looking at the DXY in the morning, I do see that there is consolidation right now, and I'm expecting FOMC to take one side of the market. So I'm going to be looking forward to trading tomorrow possibly and throughout the week. So thank you so much for joining me. Today was a negative day, but I'm never negative in my trading because it's always a positive to learn the lessons that I'm learning. And I hope that you take that kind of attitude towards your trading as well, because as long as we're learning, we're growing, and as long as we're growing, we'll get to the goals that we are setting for ourselves. All right, my friends, thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to bringing more trades like this to you and more updates. So if you haven't already, subscribe below so that you follow me every step of the way in this journey to the 7-figure mark. All right, my friends, I'll see you in the next trade. Bye.